Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to our tutorial series on Jenkins. In the last video, I walked you through the installation of the Maven integration Jenkins plugin. Before we utilize that plugin, we're going to build some additional automation on our Jenkins instance. So let's take a look at the next topic. In this video, we're going to integrate our Jenkins instance with our GitHub account. You probably remember this diagram from an earlier video describing the Jenkins architecture. What we'll be focusing on in this video is automating the trigger build and publish results steps in this sequence diagram. After automating these two steps, when a developer pushes a commit from their local machine to a GitHub repository, or when they make a commit directly in GitHub, what should happen is GitHub should trigger a Jenkins build for that GitHub repository. After the build is triggered, Jenkins will clone down the GitHub repository to its local workspace. And once the build finishes, Jenkins should automatically publish the results back to the GitHub repository. So what are some of the benefits of integrating Jenkins and GitHub? Some of these benefits you may have already guessed, but the first benefit is that it gives Jenkins the ability to clone a code base down to the local workspace so that it can build and test the code. The second benefit is that GitHub will push new changes to Jenkins and trigger builds rather than having Jenkins consistently pull GitHub repositories for new changes. Polling for new changes too frequently can be quite resource intensive on the GitHub server, and the GitHub API will actually rate limit you if you poll too frequently. The third benefit is that Jenkins will be able to perform GitHub operations, which would include doing things like publishing the build result to a GitHub pull request and to individual commits. There is one key prerequisite that I would like to point out for this integration. In order for the integration to work as described, GitHub must be able to send data to Jenkins. And since I'm using a github.com account, that means that the Jenkins instance must have a public IP. The only exception to this is if you're working on a Jenkins instance that's inside of your corporate network and you have an on-premise GitHub instance also inside of your corporate network. Now that we've covered those details, let's get started with the integration. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is navigate to my GitHub account, which I'm already in my account. And then once you're in your GitHub account, you're going to want to go up to the profile dropdown and then select settings. And under settings, we're going to navigate to developer settings. And then we're going to navigate to personal access tokens. And we're going to generate a new token, a new personal access token. Okay, we'll call it Jenkins. And after giving it a name, we have to select scopes for this token. And what scopes do is they provide a level of authorization to what your GitHub account has. So for instance, your GitHub account has access to all of your private repositories, for instance. And you can grant this token access to your private repositories, or you may not want it to have access to your private repositories. Maybe you only want it to have access to public repositories. And as we select each one of these scopes, we're adding additional levels of authorization to our GitHub account for this particular token. And for this integration to work, I'm going to be using a public GitHub repository. So the only scope that I need to select in this case is the public repo scope, which will grant this token access to public repositories. I'm going to leave all of the other scopes unchecked, and then I'm going to select Generate Token. Now on this next page, the token value is presented to us, and you're going to want to copy this value. Maybe save it in a text file temporarily, but not permanently, but at least copy it to your clipboard because we're going to use it inside of Jenkins. So I'm going to select the clipboard here, which will copy the token value. And I'm going to navigate to my Jenkins instance, which I already have pulled up. And in Jenkins, I'm going to select Manage Jenkins. And then under System Configuration, we'll go to Configure System. And then I'm going to scroll down to the GitHub section. Okay. And this GitHub section is for the GitHub plugin, which should have been automatically installed if you selected install recommended plugins when installing Jenkins. So the two plugins that are required for this integration are the GitHub plugin and the Git plugin, and both of those are installed as part of the recommended plugins when you're first installing Jenkins. And in the GitHub plugin configuration, we can add GitHub servers that we want to authenticate with. And the one that we're going to authenticate with is already automatically filled out here. So we're going to be authenticating with the public GitHub API. And I'm just going to call it GitHub. And once we've specified a name and the API URL, we also have to specify credentials to authenticate with our GitHub account, right? So we need to provide credentials to authenticate with our GitHub account. And this is going to be our personal access token that we just created. So I don't have any credentials created on this Jenkins instance right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select add, and I'm going to select the Jenkins credential provider. And on the add credentials page, I'm going to specify the kind of credential that I want to create, which in this case is going to be secret text. Okay, so the personal access token is considered a secret text credential. Okay, I'm going to leave the scope the same. And then for the secret, I'm going to paste in the personal access token value. And we'll give it an ID. We'll call it GitHub PAT. I'll leave the description blank, and then I'll select add. Okay. Now in the dropdown, we have the PAT credential that we can select. So I'm going to go ahead and select that credential. Now, once we've added our credentials, we can test the connection to the GitHub API. So I'm going to go ahead and click test connection. And you can see that it says credentials verified for user tech with Moss. And then it specifies the rate limit and how many API calls I have left. So it's set at 5,000, and I just used one to test the connection. So I have 4,999 API calls remaining before I'm rate limited. And the last configuration here is the manage hooks configuration. And when this is checked, Jenkins will basically automatically add the Jenkins webhook endpoint to the GitHub repository so that GitHub can then send data back to Jenkins. What we're going to do is we're going to manually add the webhook to our GitHub repository rather than have Jenkins automatically do it. So I'm going to uncheck this and then I'm going to select save for this configuration. And now that we've added that personal access token to this Jenkins instance, Jenkins should be able to communicate to GitHub and publish build results to a GitHub repository. But one thing to note is that I used my personal GitHub account credentials so that Jenkins could authenticate with GitHub, but it is a best practice to use something like a service account or a generic account, maybe an account that's called like Jenkins-CI or something like that, and then use that account's credentials to facilitate this particular automation. The next step is to create an SSH key pair, and we're going to add the public key to our GitHub profile and then add the private key to this Jenkins instance. And that will allow this Jenkins instance to clone down repositories to the local Jenkins workspace. So any GitHub repositories that my GitHub account has access to, this Jenkins instance will also have access to and be able to clone down when a build starts. So I'm going to open up a git bash session to generate the SSH key pair. And in my git bash window, I'm going to use SSH keygen to generate the key pair. And I'm going to accept all of the defaults. It asked me to overwrite my key pair. I'm just going to do that. And so I generated a key pair, and I'm going to cat the public key. Okay, so there's my public key, and I'm going to copy that public key to my clipboard. And then I'm going to navigate back to my GitHub profile. And in the settings menu of my GitHub profile, I'm going to go down to SSH and GPG keys. And I'm going to select new SSH key. And I'm going to paste in my public key. And I'll give it a name. I'll just call it Jenkins public key. Okay, so that added the public key to my GitHub profile, and I'm going to navigate back to Jenkins, and I'm going to open up the Git Bash window again. Now I'm going to cat the private key, and I'm going to copy the contents of the private key. Okay, so this is the private key, and I'm going to go ahead and copy that to my clipboard. Okay, and in Jenkins, I'm going to navigate to Manage Jenkins, and then I'm going to go to the Security section, and I'm going to select Manage Credentials. I'm going to select Jenkins, I'll select Global, and then I'm going to select Add Credentials. Okay, and the kind is going to be SSH username with private key. I'll leave the scope as is, and we'll call it GitHub private key. Okay, I'm going to leave the username blank, and then for the private key, I'm going to enter that directly. Okay, so I'm going to paste the private key in there. I didn't create a passphrase for this particular key, so that's all I need. I'm going to select OK. Okay, so we added the private key to Jenkins. So Jenkins, when a build starts for a particular GitHub repository, it should be able to clone down the repository using this private key that we just added. So I'm going to go back to the Jenkins dashboard. So now that we've added the SSH private key to this Jenkins instance, let's go ahead and create a new Jenkins job. So I'm going to go to the new item page, and we'll call it test job. And I'm going to select freestyle project, and then I'll select OK. All right. And in the source code management section, I'm going to select Git, and then it prompts me to enter the repository URL. So this is going to be the URL of the GitHub repository. And I have created a very simple GitHub repository. All it has is a single README file in it. So I'm going to navigate back to my GitHub profile. Okay, I'm going to select my repositories, and then I'll select this repository, which is the one that I created. It's just a very basic repository with just a README file in the repository. And I'm going to select the code tab here, and it gives me the URL. So notice how I can select different URLs. I can select an HTTPS URL or an SSH one. Make sure that you select the SSH one because we're using an SSH key pair to clone down this repository. So we need the SSH URL and not the HTTPS URL. So I'm going to select the SSH URL. I'm going to copy that to the clipboard, and I'm going to navigate back to Jenkins, and I'll paste that in. Okay, so it says failed to connect right now, and it says permission denied. So I haven't specified the credentials that I want to use in order to clone this repository down. So in the credentials section, I'm going to select the private key that was just created, and it defaults the username. So I remember that I didn't enter a username here. It automatically entered a username for me, and so I'm going to select that. And notice that the error disappears after selecting the credentials, which means that it was able to authenticate successfully, so it can clone down this repository. The next configuration is under branches to build. I'm going to specify the main branch since that's the only branch I have in my GitHub repository. And once I've specified that, I'm going to scroll down to the build triggers section. And what the GitHub plugin provides is an additional build trigger, and it's this one right here. It's GitHub hook trigger for Git SCM polling. And it says here, if Jenkins receives a push GitHub hook from a GitHub repository that's defined in the Git SCM section, it will trigger the Git SCM polling logic. Okay, basically what this means is that if GitHub receives a push from a developer, so a developer pushes a commit up to a GitHub repository, GitHub will then automatically trigger this particular Jenkins job to build if this build trigger is selected. So we are going to go ahead and check that build trigger since we want that behavior. The next configuration that we're going to set is under post build actions. I'm going to select add post build action and then set GitHub commit status. Okay. And what this action will do is when the build finishes, Jenkins will communicate the build result back to the GitHub repository, and it will set the build status on the individual commits that were built during this particular Jenkins build, as well as the pull request if there is an open pull request for the commits that were built in this particular Jenkins build. So I'm going to leave these two fields as their default values, and then under the what section, I'm going to specify the status result based on one of the default messages and statuses. So this status result basically allows me to manually define like what the status message will say based on the build result. So if I selected here result better than or equal to, let's say, success, I can provide a custom success message. But for my case, I'm just going to select the default messages in status. We don't necessarily need custom messages in this particular case. And this back reference will provide a link directly back to the build inside of GitHub. So that should be all of the configurations we need in this particular job. So I'm going to go ahead and select save. So now that we've created the Jenkins job, there's one last configuration that we need to make, and it's inside of the GitHub repository. So I'm going to navigate back to my GitHub repository. And in the repo, I'm going to select the settings page. And under settings, I'm going to navigate to the webhooks section. Okay. And webhooks allow external services to be notified when certain events happen in this particular repository. So I'm going to select add webhook. And the first field that is required is the payload URL. And this is the URL endpoint that GitHub will send data to. And in our case, it's going to be our Jenkins URL with a special endpoint added onto the base Jenkins URL. So I'm going to navigate back to Jenkins. I'm going to copy the base URL, which is right here. I'm going to paste that in, and then I'm going to add the endpoint for GitHub webhooks, which is GitHub-webhook. Okay, and then /. The content type I'm going to select as JSON. I'll leave the secret blank. And then it allows me to select which events I would like to trigger this webhook for. And I can use just the push event. I can say for any event, send me everything. Or I can say, let me select individual events. So maybe instead of the push event, I want this webhook triggered anytime a pull request is opened. And this particular selection will allow me to do that. So if I select this, then anytime a pull request is opened, closed, reopened, etc., an event will be triggered for this webhook, and that data, that event will be sent to Jenkins, and it will be sent to this particular endpoint that we provided here. Okay, and I'm going to leave it as is with just the push event being sent to the endpoint. That's really all we need right now. And I'll leave it as active, and then I'll select add webhook. Okay. And when you select add webhook, it should automatically test the connection. So I'm going to go back into the webhook, and you'll notice that under recent deliveries, we have this little check mark, and it tested the webhook, and that was successful. We got a successful 200 response back from Jenkins. So we configured this webhook correctly. So now that we've added the hook, we should be able to make commits locally on our machine and push them to GitHub, or make commits directly in the GitHub interface. And both of those actions, pushing commits as well as making commits in the GitHub interface, should trigger our Jenkins test job to run a build for this particular repository. So let's go ahead and try it out. I'm going to navigate to the code tab, and I'm going to make a commit directly in the GitHub interface. And I'm going to just edit the README file, and I'll just say, okay. And then for the commit message, I'll just say testing Jenkins. And before I select commit changes, I want to show you that our test job currently doesn't have any jobs that have ran, or any builds that have previously ran, right? So after I select commit changes, we should see a build running in this Jenkins job. Okay, so I'm going to select commit changes, and let's take a look back at our Jenkins job. And you'll notice that we have a build currently pending in the Jenkins job, and it's already finished. So if I select refresh, we can take a look at the Jenkins job, and it successfully cloned down the test repo from GitHub. There wasn't really anything in the repo, and there wasn't anything to build, any code to build or test. So it didn't really do anything except clone down the repository. And then it performed the post-build action of setting the GitHub commit status in GitHub. So what does that look like in GitHub? Let's navigate back to the GitHub repository, and I'm going to select the latest commit here. And you'll notice that next to the commit message here, we have this small check mark. That check mark indicates the status of that commit, and it says all checks have passed. And then we also get a back reference to the Jenkins job itself. So this details hyperlink goes back to the Jenkins job. So let me click that, and you'll notice that you'll see here that it goes back to the build in Jenkins. And I'll go ahead and navigate back to the GitHub repository. So this works for individual commits. If I were to look at the list of commits for a particular branch, you'll see that commits that triggered a build, if the build was successful, they'll get this small check mark next to them, and it says, you know, build number 1 succeeded in this amount of time, and you get a back reference to the Jenkins build itself. This status also pops up in pull requests. So if you have a pull request for a commit or multiple commits, then Jenkins will also post the status inside of the pull request. And let's try that out real quick. I'm going to navigate back to Jenkins. And in Jenkins, I'm going to navigate to the job, and I'm going to make one configuration change. It's going to be to the branch specifier. And I'm just going to leave this blank. So this will build for any branch, not just the main branch if I leave it blank. So I'm going to navigate back to GitHub, and I'm going to go to the code tab. And in the code tab, I'm going to create a new branch. We'll call it Jenkins test branch. I'll select create branch. And I'll make a small modification to the README file. And I'll commit these changes, and as soon as I commit the changes, this should trigger a build in our Jenkins job. And it will trigger a build since I just modified the Jenkins job to build any of the branches in this repository, not just the main branch. So I'm going to navigate back to the code tab. And in the code tab, I'm going to select compare and pull request for my branch. I'll leave everything as is, and then I'll select create pull request. And you'll notice that on the pull request page, if I scroll down here, we have this status check, and it says all checks have passed, one successful check. And if I click show all checks, it will show me the test job name, and it specifies that build 2 succeeded in half a second. And then it provides a back reference to the build itself. So if I click details, it takes me directly to build number 2. Okay. So that about wraps it up for this integration. As you can see, it's a very useful integration for optimizing the CI/CD process. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. If you'd like to learn more, be sure to follow our blog at lambdatest.com/blog, as well as our LambdaTest community at community.lambdatest.com. You can also earn resume-worthy LambdaTest Selenium certifications at lambdatest.com/certifications.